Wake the fuck up, samurai. We have a city to burn.
Ho, let me stop you right there, Johnny Silverface. Have you stopped to think that by burning a city, you might also burn the reputation of a certain company and the corpos who run it? Which would then force dozens, if not hundreds of hardworking programmers into an unyielding dark void of crunch? Have you really thought about the consequences of your actions?
You're breathtaking!
No, you can't weasel out of this! Don't sweet talk me! Yes, folks, it must be time to drag that broken, malfunctioning cyber horse onto our stage for another beating, right? Well, you know what? Let's do something slightly different. Instead of just taking you through the myriad of consequences that Cyberpunk 2077 faced after its kind of extremely infamous release, we're gonna focus on the why. Why one of the biggest titles of recent memory wound up being one of the most botched and controversial titles in recent memory. But it's more than just that, as we're going to discuss the much larger problem that the gaming industry has been staring down the barrel of for the last decade. So strap on your sword and run a final check on your implants, samurai. We've got a what happened to burn. It's 2012 and CD Projekt Red, the developer, and its parent company, just plain old CD Projekt, is seen as something of a games industry messiah.
This man is totally the son of God.
Having earned their sterling reputation through the first two Witcher games and their GOG online service. They went from a relatively unknown Polish company most AAA publishers didn't even know existed, to having something those same publishers greedily coveted: the goodwill of lots of fans, and a successful business model. Basically, the antithesis of... And unlike those that shall not be named, CD Projekt modeled their release schedule after modern Rockstar, make one massive game and ride on its success for several years. Therefore, in 2012, most people expected the announcement of a third Witcher, but were caught off guard when they instead revealed they were bringing Mike Pondsmith's tabletop RPG world, Cyberpunk, to digital life. This was seen as something of a bold move for the company, being very different when compared to the European fantasy roots they had previously established. Now, while this announcement of Cyberpunk did come in 2012, the vast majority of CDPR was putting their all into Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which had its reveal the following year. Geralt's newest adventure promised an unheard of amount of story, side content, and a map size that can only be described as turgid and pulsating. Wild Hunt had started development back around 2010, so it already had a lot of work done in its rear view, especially since CDPR utilized much of what they had learned on Witcher 2. The decision to announce Cyberpunk so early would have long-lasting effects. The first and most important one being, the game didn't actually enter full-time development for another 4 years. Wild Hunt then released on PC and consoles to widespread acclaim in May of 2015, but it was by no means perfect, especially in a technical sense. All three versions had their fair share of bugs and issues at launch, which makes sense given the game's size, scope, and complexity. This is relevant because I want you to now picture Witcher 3, but imagine it if it were far more advanced, and it needed brand new, wildly different assets, had to come out on way more machines, and on top of that, had less overall development time. I hope the stage is now properly set within your mind palace. Now, with The Witcher 3's success, 28 million copies sold, what did CD Projekt Red co-founder Marcin Iwinski owe all this success to? Well, he attributed that to 3 core pillars. Please have an oof ready for each one. Game quality, gamer-centric value proposition, and finally, and most oofingly of all, communication with fans. Once Wild Hunt and its 2 girthy DLCs were finally finished, CDPR then turned their attention towards Cyberpunk, which up to that point had had a small team drafting up art and characters and collaborating with Mike Pondsmith to create the broader conceptual strokes. Problems started arising as soon as the team realized that given the world, the futuristic setting, and the switch to first person meant a lot of the assets and tools used on Witcher couldn't be much help. Brand new systems and technology would need to be developed, built from the ground up just for Cyberpunk. So therefore, the engine that powered Wild Hunt, Red Engine 3, would need a full upgrade, and a good chunk of time in which to do so. As we've covered before, a new engine or upgrading an old one while simultaneously making a brand new game is always risky. Waiting for systems and tools to come online leads to more delays and amounts to basically designing in the dark or building a bridge as you're crossing it. It would be the company's first time tackling fully customizable characters, first-person combat and mobility, vehicles, character classes, and to get all of this done, they were going to need to staff up. In addition, once the studio looked at the scope and features that the concept team had planned and were prototyping, they decided almost everything needed to be scrapped. This was because CD Projekt higher-ups wanted the game to release on then-current consoles, the Xbox One and PS4, before Microsoft and Sony released their next-gen machines, which they were told would hit the market in 2020. This gave the team slightly less than 4 years to get her done, compared to Wild Hunt's 5, despite Cyberpunk being the far more technically challenging project and being designed for even more consoles. Around this time is also when Adam Badowski, CDPR studio head, decided to take control of the project and wanted a series of massive gameplay and design overhauls across the board. Problem here was that the employees that had been with the project since its inception disagreed with his demands, with many of them citing growing frustration with his direction. This then reportedly led to several high-level walkouts, and those that didn't quit were getting increasingly nervous about the state of the game already. Many on the team felt given Cyberpunk's complexity and all the hardware was going to be available on, that 2022 was a realistic date, given their slow progress. That slowed progress was slowed down even further due to the insistence of those same bosses to constantly be impressing publications. A vertical slice was shown at E3 2018, whose main purpose was just to wow the outside world and stoke the flames of hype, despite them not really needing to do this, as the game was always going to sell itself. The problem with an elaborate behind-closed-doors demo, and this is something other studios have had issue with, is that to program and test a polished slice of gameplay that highlights multiple features and have senior staff travel halfway around the world to show off is time better spent just buckling the fuck down on the main developmental pipeline. You can't just grab any random bit of a level and off you go. It's a much more involved process than that, and really it only took resources away from a game that needed every hand on deck. This, of course, is all made far, far worse, however, with the revelation that the demo wasn't real. It showed off systems, gameplay, and graphical polish that the final game was always going to lack, as it was made to simply wow the press and nothing more. It was definitely leaning towards being a potential target of what the team hoped to achieve rather than what was actually achievable. If you are one of those unfortunate enough to remember Colonial Marines, then this was eerily similar to Dr. Greasy's Magic Demo, which also happened to be another behind closed doors presentation. Oh, and if I didn't mention this already, this was a decision made by the higher-ups. Many on the dev team felt that this demo was a waste of time in a situation where there was no time. So it's around this year, 2018, that the marketing machine behind Cyberpunk started to eclipse Cyberpunk itself, which is sadly ironic given its source material. For the company in general, selling the game to the highest number of people took priority over solving this problem or squashing this bug or getting smooth performance out of old tech. When concerns are raised over the game's quality and the slow progress made on the old consoles, the attitude from team leads and their bosses was always something like, "Oh, it'll all come together in the end. That's how we pulled off the Witcher games, right?" So by that logic, everything's gonna be just... No, they weren't. With a looming release date, being understaffed while working towards that release date, and a litany of technical hurdles yet to overcome, a certain character enters Night City, one that a lot of game developers know pretty well, but now they've taken on a brand new form, a slicker, cooler, more cyber crunch. Crunch culture has been criticized for the last number of years, with many big pubs and devs having already seen blowback for mandating it, so of course there were concerns that CD Projekt Red was going that same route, given that the marketing was constantly fluffing up the game's size and content.
In Night City, you can become anyone.
Every decision you make will have consequences. The most believable city in any open-world game to date.
No matter how you slice it though, it's always a bad look on the company, as it often comes down to poor planning and scheduling on the parts of the decision makers, especially when there's data that shows crunching, more often than not, hinders a project rather than helps it. With that in mind, CD Projekt Red was quick to condemn the practice and stated there would be zero or minimal crunch, before they immediately pressured many employees to crunch. It all comes down to the fact that, for bosses, it's just a simple matter of math. If you throw enough people at a problem, and they're all putting in extra hours, the job will get done on time, yeah? Well, when someone is on their 14th straight hour of looking at a screen, then they are likely to make more mistakes and have to redo the work they just did. It also quickly leads to burnout, both mentally and physically, and while it's not exactly known how much and how long this crunch period lasted, many unnamed employees have reported that they were pressured by their bosses to put in extra hours. This was then all compounded by the fact that at E3 2019, when CD Projekt announced an initial April 2020 launch, several staff members thought it was some type of sick joke. Given their progress, there was no way they'd be able to make that date and keep up the level of quality that their fans expected. Now, let's reiterate, this company's last game sold 28 million copies, and they make regular revenue via GOG, so they were not, by any stretch of the imagination, struggling to keep the lights on. They could have just pushed the game back another year, but the plan was to always put out Xbox One and PS4 versions while those machines were still viable, and then to essentially double dip with the PS5 and Xbox Series X. This was the plan that the CD Projekt upper management had carved into stone, and what they sold their investors on, putting the game out on as many formats as technically possible. All told, there would be something like 9 different versions: the PC, the Xbox One, the Xbox One X, the Xbox One running on the Series X, the PS4, the PS4 Pro, and the all of these SKUs and configurations meant that they would need their own round of testing and submission periods. This was by far the most work CD Projekt had ever done on one singular game. And of course, by this time, it became clear to a lot of engineers and programmers that the base Xbox One and PS4 weren't up for what was being asked of them. The complexity and density of Night City was obviously designed with high-end PCs in mind, so when it was suggested to simply cancel the last-gen versions and delay the whole game by like another year, the answer was simply no. taking advantage of smart delivery and free upgrades was too enticing to pass up, so upper management was unmovable with their 2020 mandate. So, with a year left to go, the hype train was going into overdrive as it crashed into E3 2019, as it was going to be the game's last big showing. They needed to impress, and who better than Ted Neodor, Johnny Wick, Constantine, Utah Logan to hawk Cyberpunk on stage. It was really the flex that pushed the game over the top in a lot of people's eyes. If Cyberpunk 2077 wasn't a name on everyone's radars before, it certainly was after. Given this, it shouldn't shock your software to know that the game's marketing budget dwarfed what it actually cost to design and program, $121 million to $209 million, making for a grand total of $330. This also makes it the second most expensive game of all time, and as I know you're curious, the first is Red Dead Redemption 2 and its magical shrinking horse testicles. Cyberpunk was pretty much everywhere by that point, being positioned as this massive leap forward, the next-gen title that made you scream at your mom,
Bunny!
Cyberpunk 2077.
Go to hell! Bart!
Wherever you looked, it was punk this, cyber that. Everyone was trying to cash in on the fad. And you'd see the same neon-drenched anarchist aesthetic everywhere. And frankly, it was getting overexposed to the point that you can now own a cyberpunk-infused Flophouse 2069 poster, exclusive to pixelempire.com/Matt McMuscles. There's also a selection of What Happened shirts, mugs, masks, and etc. Hit the link in the description and order now, you absolute cyber samurai legend. Anyway, by the end of 2019, even the higher-ups couldn't deny that the game was dog rough, and simply wouldn't make its April release date in any presentable fashion. So, aspiring street kids, nomads, and corpos were told it was going to take a fair bit longer, from April to September, for them to be able to enter Night City. Now, for a big AAA game of this type, one big delay or two is pretty common, but then a specific type of bug that CDPR could never have foreseen raised its very ugly head. Long story short, the industry was turned upside down on its head as a result. Big studios and publishers had to transition staff to work at home, leading to a whole host of logistical problems few knew how to handle. One of these issues was that due to security measures for console test kits, the team were not allowed to take said hardware home, something very common throughout the industry. Work on the PC version was then prioritized even further, since most employees could access that build from home. This then obfuscated just how poorly the game was running on the old-gen consoles to many on the team, and resulted in them lagging behind even further, if that were possible. It did a lot to really mask the magnitude of the problem, and when management realized just how badly things were going, the game slipped again by another 2 months, this time to November. As the team feverishly worked during those 60 days, marketing, or whoever, decided it would be a great idea to publicly announce that the game was finished and that gold masters were being sent out for printing, and everything was okie dokie artichokey for the November launch. Now, you typically do need a month to allow for physical manufacturing, but with crashes still crashing and all the compatibility issues with the Playbox Series S Pro stations or whatever, programmers knew this still wasn't shippable, even with day one patches. Thus, that premature announcement was taken back, and an additional 3 weeks were allocated, pushing it incredibly close down to the end of the 2020 deadline. Yes, the game was content complete, but announcing to your millions of eager and sometimes hostile fanbase that the game was done, but then delaying it again, well, it would have been better if they just hadn't said anything at all.
Johnny, did you see what happened? Something feels off here.
You don't say.
So, for every day of those 3 weeks, you best believe that those programmers and QA testers went through a bunch of cruncha. And while they undoubtedly fixed hundreds of horrendous issues, it just wasn't enough in the end. All versions of Cyberpunk 2077 were plagued with numerous issues, some ranging from minor to major to, well, really major. While the PC version was the best of the SKUs by a badland mile, it certainly wasn't flawless. But it's the base console ports that were the real embarrassment. And this is when all this shit just happened. CD Projekt Red's investors filed multiple lawsuits, claiming they had been lied to. The game wasn't nearly as progressive or as customizable as a lot of the marketing led some people to believe. Sony removed Cyberpunk 2077 from its online store and offered customers refunds, something that CD Projekt Red would need to front the bill for. Let me say that again. Sony, yeah, Life of Black Tiger, that's cool, put on our store, Computer Entertainment, looked at Cyberpunk and said, nah, son, this is too fucked up, get this shit out of here! And, as of this writing, it's still not available to buy digitally. Microsoft, while not deleting the game outright, nevertheless put a warning label on the game's page, letting users know that, yeah, this shit's rough. But even with all of this, and even taking into account all the refunds, CD Projekt were quick to announce that the game still managed to shift 13 million copies in its first 10 days. That's over $700 million in profit, and it caused the company's stock price to rise, after having dipped for a little while, of course. This is still a phenomenal financial success by any measure, and not really the issue of this story, as it's more centered around perception and reputation. This was the first time that CD Projekt took a hit square on the jaw, had their balls exposed on stream, etc., etc. And it wasn't just in front of casual mainstream fans who might only be passingly familiar with them or Cyberpunk, but rather their hardcore fanbase. They then tried their best to mitigate the damage with a somber 5-minute video of co-founder Marcin Owinski explaining where they went wrong and what they'd be doing to fix it. While appreciated, it's kind of unfortunate that the roadmap he detailed for all the various fixes and patches hasn't really worked out. The first major one, scheduled for late February, was delayed due to a cyber attack that the company suffered at the hands of hackers days after Owinski's video. No need to get too deep into it, but here is the message left by the hackers.
Your public image will go down the shitter even more, and people will see how shitty your company functions. Investors will lose trust in your company, and the stock will dive even lower. Dead sick.
Having to deal with the breach, probably seeking legal advice and recourse due to the hack, and upping their security in general delayed the patch to late March.
Supposed to go smooth. No problems.
The dedicated PS5 and Xbox Series X versions also have no firm release dates other than 2021, and the game's DLC has also been pushed back to, I don't know. And hell man, remember this thing was supposed to have multiplayer? I can't imagine how far off that is, so I don't know, maybe my kids who don't exist will play it someday. The game's entire 5 to 10 year schedule has been thrown off by everything, and it's really unclear if people will even care about Cyberpunk by the time it's actually up to spec. Now, it is true that games like Destiny, Final Fantasy XIV, and No Man's Sky have made big comebacks, but that might not hold true here since currently Cyberpunk's strictly a single-player affair. Going back to that issue of reputation, everyone is told that delays are good, at least in theory. It gives extra time to polish, gives the devs a little more wiggle room, and it'll be worth it in the end. When faced with a delay, marketing wants gamers to view them in a more positive light. Oh, if they're delaying it this much, then it's gonna be amazing. Way better than game X or Y that I was disappointed in the other year. But here, all the delays only made things worse in the eyes of a lot of fans and investors because it wasn't really worth it, even though what they shipped into stores was 1,000 times better than what they had ready in April. It's the end product that counts. And if this video leaves you with anything, let it be that every programmer, artist, musician, voice actor, and QA tester worked their asses off every step of the way. None of them wanted to ship an underwhelming, buggy mess. None of them wanted to disappoint you. It has to come down to the mentality of upper management who are not on the floor every day and maybe missing the full picture of a given project.
I don't know why, but I just couldn't deal with the pressure.
They're too busy telling investors what they want to hear and shoving their heads into the sand whenever bad news is brought to them. The onus is really on them here, and they knew it. You'll rarely, or rather never, see anyone from EA or Bethesda
Thank you.
owning up to problems or botched releases. President Adam Kaczynski did. We ignored signals about the need for additional time to refine the game on the base last-gen consoles. It was the wrong approach and against our business philosophy. I and the entire leadership team are deeply sorry for this. But more so than just Cyberpunk itself, this is a cautionary tale about where this industry is headed. Games simply can't continue to be made this way, where ambition and scope get wildly out of control, and even if technology can capture some of that imagination, doesn't mean they always should. Human beings simply can't give the hours needed to make these things under unrealistic timeframes and poor planning. Epic open-world games like Cyberpunk or The Witcher are a pillar of the industry, and they need to be there, but companies need to be far, far smarter in how they go about making them. Because, as we've seen, CD Projekt, a company built on quality, transparency, and reputation, were susceptible to the same traps as any big company wanting to chase that record-setting fiscal quarter. And we'll just have to see if they've learned anything from their disastrous tour of Night City.
It's one of those places where expectations and reality collided, resulting in a heap of disappointment.
Alright, it's done. You can stop asking me now, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you know of any other massively mismanaged metropolises, let me know in the comments below. Take a synthwave-flavored cruise over to my Twitter, or bust into the corporate offices of the Flophouse VIP Patreon to nominate the next episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.